My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger. The bald head that stared back at me was still foreign, even 3 months after the last chemotherapy session. I touched the smooth skin where my silver hair used to cascade in waves, feeling the vulnerability that came with being so exposed. The oncologist had said the hair would grow back, but sitting here in my bedroom at 64, preparing for my first date in over a decade, I wondered if I had the courage to walk into that restaurant looking like this. The blue silk scarf my daughter Sarah had given me lay folded on the dresser, soft as a whisper. I'd worn it to every doctor's appointment, wrapped it around my head like armor against the stares and whispered conversations that followed me through grocery store aisles. But tonight felt different. Tonight, I wanted to be honest about who I was now, not hide behind pretty fabrics and careful arrangements. My hands trembled as I applied the lipstick, a warm coral that Sarah insisted brought out the color in my eyes. The mascara went on easier now without having to work around reading glasses perched on my nose. Strange how cancer had given me a few small gifts wrapped in the devastation. My eyesight had improved, probably from all the medical attention, and my skin had a clarity I hadn't seen since my 30s. The phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from Margaret, my friend who'd orchestrated this whole evening. Remember, his name is Robert, retired teacher, loves classical music, lost his wife 2 years ago. He's nervous too, Eleanor. Give him a chance. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply button. How do you tell someone that you're not sure you remember how to be on a date? That the last man who'd seen me undressed was my husband of 38 years and he'd been gone for 14 months now? That chemotherapy had changed more than just my hair? It had stripped away layers of confidence I'd spent a lifetime building. The restaurant was only 15 minutes away, but I'd allowed myself an hour to get ready. The extra time stretched before me like a chasm I needed to cross. I walked to the closet and pulled out the dress I'd chosen, navy blue with small white flowers, conservative enough to feel safe, but fitted enough to remind me I still had a figure worth noticing. The fabric felt cool against my skin as I slipped it on, and for a moment, I could pretend I was getting ready for dinner with Thomas, my late husband, instead of meeting a complete stranger. The memory hit me like a wave. Thomas's hands helping me with the zipper of this very dress, his lips brushing the back of my neck as he whispered that I looked beautiful. We'd worn our love like comfortable shoes by the end. No need for grand gestures or nervous anticipation. Just the quiet certainty of being known completely by another person. Now I stood alone in front of the full-length mirror, practicing introductions to my reflection. Hello, I'm Eleanor. Too formal. Hi, I'm Ellie. Too casual for a first meeting. Good evening. Like I was greeting the Queen of England. The doorbell rang, cutting through my rehearsal. I glanced at the clock. 6:15. Robert wasn't supposed to pick me up. We'd agreed to meet at the restaurant. My heart hammered as I walked to the front door, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. Through the peephole, I saw Sarah standing on my porch, holding what looked like a bottle of wine and wearing her concerned daughter expression. I opened the door to find her studying my face with the intensity of a detective. "Mom, you look." She paused, and I braced myself for the gentle criticism that had become her way of caring for me since the diagnosis. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. "You look brave and beautiful, really beautiful." "I look bald," I said, touching my scalp self-consciously. "No, you look like yourself, more yourself than you have in months." She stepped inside and set the wine on the hall table. "I brought this for when you get home tonight, either to celebrate or to fortify yourself for the next one." "There might not be a next one," I said, walking back toward the bedroom with Sarah following. "Why not?" "Look at me, Sarah. I'm a 64-year-old woman with no hair, no husband, and no idea how to make conversation with a strange man over dinner. What am I supposed to talk about? My cancer treatments? My grief counseling sessions? The fact that I cry every time I hear that song your father used to hum while he shaved? Sarah sat on the edge of my bed, watching me fuss with my earrings in the mirror. You talk about books. You've read more novels this year than most people read in a lifetime. You talk about your garden. Those tomatoes you grew were legendary. You talk about your volunteer work at the library or that pottery class you've been taking. You have a life, Mom, a good life. Cancer didn't take that away. I turned to face her, seeing Thomas' eyes looking back at me from our daughter's face. What if he takes one look at me and makes an excuse to leave? Then he's an idiot and you dodge a bullet. Sarah stood and walked over to me, adjusting the collar of my dress with the same gentle precision I'd once used on her school uniforms. But what if he doesn't? What if he sees what I see? A woman who fought for her life and won, who raised 3 beautiful children and loved a man completely for nearly 40 years, who makes the best apple pie in the county and knows the name of every bird that visits her backyard feeder. The tears came then, hot and sudden. Sarah handed me a tissue and waited while I composed myself, not rushing or offering empty reassurances. I miss him so much, I whispered. Some mornings I wake up and for just a second, I forget he's gone. I reach across the bed expecting to find him there. I know, but Dad wouldn't want you to spend the rest of your life reaching for ghosts. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. He'd want you to reach for something real, even if it's just friendship and conversation over a good meal. I nodded, knowing she was right, but still feeling like I was betraying something sacred by getting dressed up for another man. The guilt sat heavy in my chest, mixing with anticipation and terror in a way that made it hard to breathe. The scarf or no scarf? I asked, holding up the blue silk. Sarah considered this seriously. What feels right to you? I looked in the mirror again, seeing the woman I'd become rather than mourning the one I'd been. The chemotherapy had taken my hair, but it had also taken the cancer. I was alive, sitting in my bedroom, getting ready for a date. A year ago, that had seemed impossible. No scarf, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Sarah smiled and kissed my forehead. Call me when you get home. And Mom, have fun. You deserve to have fun. After she left, I stood in the quiet house, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick away the minutes. The sound had once been comforting, a steady heartbeat in the home Thomas and I had built together. Tonight, it felt like a countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. At 10 minutes before 7, I gathered my purse, checked my lipstick one more time, and walked out into the evening air. The October sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and the maple tree in my front yard had turned the color of fire. Thomas had planted that tree the year Sarah was born, insisting we needed something beautiful to mark the occasion. Now it stood tall and strong, its roots deep in the soil we tended together. I drove slowly toward downtown, taking the long way past the park where Thomas and I used to walk on summer evenings. The familiar route felt like a prayer, each turn and landmark a small blessing. When I finally pulled into the restaurant parking lot, my hands were steady on the steering wheel, and something like peace had settled in my chest. The hostess at Bella Vista smiled warmly when I approached. Table for 2? The gentleman is already here. The restaurant hummed with the gentle conversation of couples sharing Friday evening meals, the soft clink of silverware against plates, and the background notes of jazz that seemed to float just above the amber lighting. I followed the hostess through the dining room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor with what felt like announcements of my arrival. Several people glanced up as we passed, and I found myself wondering if they could tell I was on a blind date, if my nervousness was visible like a neon sign above my head. "Right this way," the hostess said, leading me toward a table near the window where a man sat with his back to me, reading what looked like a wine menu through glasses perched on the end of his nose. My steps slowed as we approached. This was it, the moment when I would either find connection or endure polite conversation until I could escape home to Sarah's wine and my own familiar solitude. The man looked up as the hostess spoke his name, and when he turned to face me, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet in a way that had nothing to do with my heels. Robert had kind eyes, the color of coffee with just a touch of cream, and a smile that reached them immediately when he saw me. But what stopped me in my tracks was the way he looked at me, not with the careful politeness I'd expected, not with the barely concealed disappointment I'd feared, but with something close to wonder. His gaze moved from my face to my bald head and back again, and instead of the awkward pause I'd rehearsed responses for, his smile grew wider. "Eleanor," he said, standing and extending his hand, "you're even more beautiful than Margaret described." The words hit me like a gentle blow to the chest. Beautiful. When was the last time someone had called me beautiful? Thomas, certainly, but husbands were required to say such things. This stranger, this man who owed me nothing, was looking at me like I was something precious he'd discovered unexpectedly. "You must be Robert," I managed, accepting his handshake and trying to ignore the warmth that spread up my arm from the contact. "Please sit," he said, moving quickly to pull out my chair. The gesture was old-fashioned, courtly, and it reminded me of my father helping my mother into her seat at Sunday dinners when I was young. As I settled into the chair, I caught our reflection in the window glass. A bald woman in a flowered dress and a silver-haired man in a navy blazer. Both of us marked by time, but somehow sitting together in this warm circle of light. The image should have looked strange, mismatched, but instead it looked possible. "I have to tell you," Robert said, settling back into his chair. "When Margaret told me about you, she mentioned that you'd been through some health challenges recently. I hope you don't mind that I know." My cheeks flushed hot. "What exactly did she tell you?" "Just that you're a warrior," he said simply, "and that you have a beautiful spirit that cancer couldn't touch." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes and blinked them back quickly. "I'm sorry. I thought I was past crying at the drop of a hat." "Don't apologize. I cried in the grocery store last week when they were playing my wife's favorite song over the sound system." He reached across the table and touched my hand briefly. "We're both carrying some tender places, I think." The waitress appeared beside our table, young and efficient, with a warmth that suggested she'd seen enough first dates to recognize one. "Good evening, folks. Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Wine?" Robert asked, looking at me questioningly. "Please, red if that's okay with you." "Perfect. Could we see your wine list?" He smiled at the waitress, then turned back to me. "I used to teach high school English, so I'm a bit of a wine amateur, but I've learned enough to be dangerous." "What did you teach?" I asked, grateful for the safe territory of career talk. "Literature mainly, some creative writing. 35 years of trying to convince teenagers that Shakespeare was actually writing about them, just in more elaborate language." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "What about you? Margaret mentioned you were a librarian." "Am," I corrected. "I still work part-time. Children's services mostly. Story time for the little ones, reading programs for elementary students. It keeps me young, or at least makes me feel useful." "That's wonderful. I always thought librarians were magicians, connecting people with exactly the book they needed at exactly the right moment." The waitress returned with the wine list, and Robert studied it with the concentration of a scholar. I found myself watching his hands as he turned the pages. Strong hands with long fingers, the kind that looked like they'd held books and chalk and probably grandchildren. "The Chianti looks nice," he said. "Or if you prefer something lighter, this Pinot Noir is from Oregon." Surprise me, I said, and immediately wondered if I was talking about more than wine. He ordered the Chianti and turned his attention back to me. So tell me about the children's programs at the library. Do you have a favorite age group? I found myself relaxing into the conversation, describing the toddlers who couldn't sit still during story time but hung on every word, the shy 6-year-olds who discovered they loved chapter books, the 10-year-olds who thought they were too old for the library until they found the graphic novel section. Robert listened with the attention of someone who understood the magic of watching young minds discover new worlds. You light up when you talk about them, he observed as the waitress poured our wine. They keep me honest. Children don't care if you're having a bad day or if you look different from the last time they saw you. They just want the story. I paused, touching my head self-consciously. When I first went back to work after treatment, I was terrified. I thought they'd stare or ask uncomfortable questions. And did they? One little girl, maybe 4 years old, walked right up to me and said, "Your head is like an egg." Then she hugged my legs and asked if I had any books about dinosaurs. I laughed at the memory. Kids have a way of reducing everything to its simplest terms. Robert raised his wine glass. To simplicity, then, and to 4-year-olds with perfect timing. We clinked glasses, and I tasted the wine, rich and warm with hints of cherry. It was perfect, like he'd somehow known exactly what I would like. The thought made me wonder what else about me he might intuitively understand. "Margaret tells me you're musical," I said. "Do you play?" "Piano, badly. I keep promising myself I'll take proper lessons now that I'm retired, but old habits die hard. I learned by ear as a kid and never quite shook the tendency to improvise around the difficult parts." He grinned sheepishly. "What about you? Any hidden talents I should know about?" "I sing in the church choir, though my voice has gotten a bit rusty. And I've been taking pottery classes since—" I paused, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Since my husband died? Since I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't related to grief. Since you decided to try something new?" Robert suggested gently. "Since I realized I needed to remember how to create things instead of just preserving them." The honesty surprised me, but something about his expression invited truth. The waitress returned to take our dinner order. Robert recommended the salmon, mentioning that he'd eaten here before and found it excellent. I chose the chicken marsala, partly because it sounded delicious, and partly because it was something I'd never tried to make at home. Tonight seemed like a good time for small adventures. "So," Robert said after the waitress left, "Margaret also mentioned that you lost your husband recently. I'm sorry for your loss." The words hung between us, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with any mention of Thomas. 14 months ago. Heart attack. Very sudden. That's the hardest kind, I think. No time to prepare. No chance to say the things you want to say. I looked at him carefully. "How long were you married?" 42 years. Patricia had cancer, ovarian. We had 8 months to say everything we needed to say, and somehow it still wasn't enough time. He rotated his wine glass slowly between his palms. "I'm not sure which way is easier, if either way can be called easy." "I don't think any of it is easy," I said. "But I imagine having time to prepare helps with some things." "Maybe. But it also means watching someone you love suffer, feeling helpless to fix it. There were days I would have given anything for it to be quick and merciful instead of drawn out and painful." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, two people who understood the weight of loss in a way that couldn't be explained to those who hadn't carried it. Around us, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, but our table felt like an island of quiet understanding. "When did you know you were ready to try this?" I asked, gesturing between us. "Dating, I mean." Robert considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure I am ready, but Margaret can be very persuasive, and I realized that being ready might be less important than being open to possibility." He looked directly at me. What about you? Honestly, I'm terrified. This is my first date since 1979. 1979? His eyebrows rose. That's impressive. In a good way, I mean. You were married to your high school sweetheart? College. We met in a Victorian literature class. He was the teaching assistant, and I was a junior who thought she knew everything about the Bronte sisters. The memory made me smile. He proved me wrong about Charlotte, and I spent the next 38 years being delighted by how much more there was to discover about him. Our dinner arrived as the sun was setting outside the window, casting the restaurant in golden light that made everything feel warm and intimate. Robert had been right about the salmon. It looked perfectly prepared, garnished with herbs and accompanied by what appeared to be roasted vegetables. My chicken marsala smelled heavenly, rich with wine and mushrooms. This looks amazing, I said, cutting into the tender chicken. Patricia used to say that food tastes better when you're enjoying the company. Robert paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep bringing her up. It's just that some observations feel too true not to share. Please don't apologize. I understand completely. I took a sip of wine, gathering courage. Thomas used to say that the best meals weren't about the food at all, but about the stories shared around the table. I think he would have liked you. The words surprised me as they left my mouth. I hadn't expected to feel Thomas' presence so gently tonight, not as a barrier between Robert and me, but as a warm approval settling around my shoulders like a familiar shawl. Tell me about him, Robert said, if you're comfortable doing that. He was a high school principal for most of his career, the kind of man who knew every student's name and never met a problem he didn't think could be solved with patience and the right conversation. I smiled, remembering. He collected old jazz records and could fix anything that broke in our house. He made pancakes every Saturday morning for 38 years, even after our children moved out and it was just the two of us. He sounds like a good man. The best. He would have been mortified by the idea of me sitting here alone, afraid to enjoy myself because it felt like betrayal. I looked down at my hands, surprised by the clarity of this realization. He was always pushing me to try new things, to be braver than I felt. What kind of new things? Oh, traveling places I thought were too adventurous, taking that pottery class I mentioned, learning to drive a stick shift when I was 55 because he thought I should know how. I laughed. He signed us up for ballroom dancing lessons once, convinced that we needed more romance in our routine. Were you any good? Terrible. We stepped on each other's feet constantly, and I could never remember which way to turn. But we laughed until our sides hurt, and afterward we'd go for ice cream, and Thomas would dip me dramatically beside the car just to make me giggle. Robert's expression had grown soft as I talked. You miss him terribly. Every day. But tonight, I paused, trying to find the right words. Tonight, I paused, trying to find the right words. Tonight, I feel like he's here, in a way, approving of this. Does that sound strange? Not at all. Sometimes I feel Patricia nudging me forward, telling me to stop being so careful with my heart. He took another bite of salmon, chewing thoughtfully. What would Thomas say about tonight? He'd probably ask if you made me laugh, if you opened doors for me, and whether you ordered good wine. I grinned. So far, you're passing his test. Good to know I have his approval. What about yours? The question caught me off guard, direct and honest in a way that demanded the same in return. I looked across the table at this man who'd appeared in my life like a gift I wasn't sure I deserved. Kind, attentive, apparently untroubled by my baldness or my grief, or the way I sometimes stumbled over words when emotions caught me unexpectedly. You're not what I expected, I said carefully. In what way? Margaret described you as a nice retired teacher who liked classical music and needed someone to talk to. She made you sound safe, uncomplicated. Robert laughed, a rich sound that made something flutter in my chest. And I'm not safe? Oh, you're safe, but you're also— I struggled to find the right word. You're magnetic. The way you listen, the way you look at me like I'm the most interesting person in the room. It's been a long time since someone made me feel visible in that way. You are the most interesting person in the room, he said simply. You're brave and beautiful, and you've survived things that would break other people. How could I not be captivated? The word hung between us like a small miracle. Captivated. When was the last time anyone had been captivated by me? Not grateful, not fond, not comfortable with my presence, but actually enchanted? I should tell you something, Robert said, his expression growing more serious. When Margaret first mentioned you, she showed me a picture, an old one from before your treatment. My stomach dropped. Here it was, the moment when he admitted disappointment, when he revealed that meeting the real me had been a letdown after seeing the version with hair and health and the confidence that came with both. I thought you were lovely in the photo, he continued. But when you walked into this restaurant tonight, when I saw you for the first time, he shook his head. Eleanor, you took my breath away. Not despite how you look now, but because of it. You're radiant. You're luminous. You look like someone who's fought death and won. And that kind of victory changes a person's face in the most beautiful way. Tears spilled over before I could stop them, running down my cheeks and probably taking my mascara with them. Robert handed me his napkin without comment, waiting while I composed myself. I'm sorry, I whispered. I didn't. What? To feel beautiful again. To feel like someone worth knowing. Oh, Eleanor, Robert's voice was gentle. You're worth so much more than knowing. You're worth cherishing. The waitress appeared at our table, clearly concerned by my tears. Is everything okay here? Can I get you anything? Just the check, please, Robert said, and maybe some coffee if you have it. Of course, 2 coffees coming right up. When she left, Robert reached across the table and took my hand properly this time. Not just a brief touch, but a real connection. His palm was warm and slightly calloused, probably from whatever hobbies had replaced teaching in his retirement. I have a confession, he said. I almost canceled tonight, 3 times actually. Why? Because I was terrified that you'd take one look at me and see an old man trying to recapture something that was never meant to be recaptured. Because I wasn't sure I remembered how to be charming or interesting or anything other than lonely. I squeezed his hand, and now I think we're both braver than we knew. The coffee arrived, rich and dark in small white cups, accompanied by tiny cookies shaped like hearts. Such a small detail, but it felt significant, as if the universe was offering us little signs of sweetness, small promises that good things were still possible. What happens next? I asked, stirring cream into my coffee. What would you like to happen next? The question was loaded with possibility, and I felt my pulse quicken. What did I want to happen next? More evenings like this one, certainly. More conversations that felt like discoveries. More moments when I felt like a woman instead of just a survivor. I'd like to see you again, I said, surprising myself with my directness. Tomorrow? Robert asked, then laughed at his own eagerness. I mean, when you're comfortable, no pressure. Tomorrow might be too soon, I said, then saw his face fall slightly. But maybe this weekend? There's a concert at the community center on Saturday evening. Local musicians, nothing fancy, but the acoustics are wonderful. I'd love that. Should I pick you up, or would you prefer to meet there? Pick me up, I said, making another small choice toward trust, toward letting someone care for me again. We finished our coffee slowly, neither of us eager to end the evening. Robert told me about his retirement hobbies: woodworking, volunteering at the animal shelter, trying to learn Italian through online courses. I shared my plans for expanding the children's reading garden at the library, my experiments with glazing techniques in pottery class, my secret dream of taking a cooking class focused on French cuisine. Julia Child was 78 when she published her last cookbook, Robert said. It's never too late to learn something that feeds the soul. Is that what you're doing with Italian? Partly, but mostly I'm planning a trip to Tuscany. Patricia always wanted to go, and we kept putting it off. Now I'm thinking of going for both of us. That sounds wonderful and terrifying. The best adventures usually are. He signaled for the check. What scares you about French cooking? Making a fool of myself, burning expensive ingredients, discovering I have no natural talent for something I think I'll love. What if you do have talent for it? What if you're amazing? The possibility hadn't occurred to me. I'd become so accustomed to protecting myself from disappointment that I'd stopped imagining success. The drive home was quiet, comfortable silence punctuated by gentle conversation about music, books, and the unseasonably warm weather. Robert walked me to my front door like a gentleman from an earlier era, and when he took my hands in both of his, I felt 16 again. "Thank you," he said, "for taking a chance on tonight, for being exactly who you are." "Thank you for seeing me," I replied, "really seeing me." He kissed my cheek softly, a whisper of affection that promised more without demanding anything. Then he waited until I was safely inside before walking back to his car, and I watched from the window as his taillights disappeared around the corner. The house felt different when I walked inside, as if the air itself had been rearranged by the evening's possibilities. I moved through the familiar rooms, past Thomas's reading chair that I still couldn't bring myself to move, past the kitchen where his coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, past the photographs on the mantel that chronicled our life together. And instead of the usual weight of solitude, I felt something lighter settling around my shoulders. In the bathroom, I studied my reflection again, but this time I saw what Robert had seen. Not a sick woman or a widow or someone diminished by loss, but a person who had survived, who was still becoming, who might yet have chapters left to write. The face looking back at me was changed, certainly, marked by treatment and grief and time, but it was also alive with something new, hope maybe, or the memory of being desired. I called Sarah as promised, settling into the chair by my bedroom window with the phone cradled against my ear. "Mom, how did it go?" Her voice was eager, nervous, protective all at once. "It was wonderful," I said, and heard my own surprise in the words. "He was wonderful." "Really? Tell me everything. What did he look like? What did you talk about? Did he seem interested?" I laughed at her rapid-fire questions, remembering asking her similar things when she'd started dating in high school. The role reversal felt strange, but not unpleasant. He looked like a man who's lived a full life and isn't finished living it yet. We talked about books and music and loss and possibility, and yes, sweetheart, he seemed very interested. I knew it! Sarah's delight was infectious. I knew once he met you, really met you, he'd see what we all see. What do we all see? That you're remarkable, Mom, that you're beautiful and strong and funny and worth falling in love with all over again. The words made my throat tight with emotion. We're seeing each other again on Saturday, a concert. Mom, that's amazing! What are you going to wear? Do you need me to come over and help you? Sarah, I interrupted her gently, I think I can manage on my own, but thank you for caring so much about my happiness. Of course I care. You're my mother, and you deserve to be cherished. Cherished. The word Robert had used echoed in my daughter's voice, and I realized that maybe everyone around me had been seeing possibilities I'd been too frightened to acknowledge. After we hung up, I poured myself a small glass of the wine Sarah had brought and carried it out to the back porch. The October air was cool but not uncomfortable, and the stars were visible despite the suburban light pollution. Thomas and I used to sit out here on summer evenings, sharing the quiet and watching fireflies dance above the lawn. Tonight, I sat alone but didn't feel lonely. Instead, I felt expectant, as if something good was approaching just beyond my ability to see it clearly. The wine was smooth and warming, and I sipped it slowly while replaying the evening in my mind. Robert's words came back to me, "You're worth cherishing." When Thomas was alive, I'd known this truth in my bones, not because I was vain or self-important, but because his love had reflected my worth back to me daily for nearly 4 decades. After he died, that mirror had shattered, and I'd lost the ability to see myself as anything other than leftover, a partial person missing her better half. But tonight, across a restaurant table, another pair of eyes had shown me a different reflection. Not Thomas's wife, not cancer's victim, not an old woman trying desperately to hold on to youth, but Eleanor, complete, worthy, capable of inspiring desire and affection and respect. The phone rang again, startling me from my reverie. I expected Sarah calling back with forgotten questions, but the caller ID showed Margaret's number. "Well," she said without preamble when I answered, "don't keep me in suspense. How was my matchmaking?" "Your matchmaking," I said, unable to keep the smile from my voice, "was inspired. I knew it. I knew you two would hit it off. Robert called me 20 minutes ago, absolutely smitten. He couldn't stop talking about how radiant you looked, how intelligent and funny you were. He asked me if I thought it was too soon to ask you out again." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that any man lucky enough to capture Eleanor Walsh's attention should probably strike while the iron is hot." Margaret's laughter was warm. "But seriously, honey, I'm so happy for you. You both deserve to find companionship and joy. It was just one dinner, Margaret. Let's not plan the wedding yet." "Oh, I'm not planning anything, but I am hoping you'll let yourself enjoy whatever develops. You've earned the right to some happiness." After Margaret hung up, I finished my wine and prepared for bed, going through the routines that had become my evening ritual since becoming a widow. But tonight, each familiar task felt different. Brushing my teeth, applying moisturizer to my face, selecting tomorrow's clothes. Instead of ending another day of survival, I was preparing for sleep that might bring dreams of possibility. I slipped between the sheets and reached automatically for Thomas's pillow, as I had every night for 14 months. But instead of clutching it desperately against the ache of missing him, I held it gently, like a blessing received, rather than a comfort desperately needed. "What do you think?" I whispered into the darkness, speaking to my late husband as I sometimes did when the house was quiet and my heart was full of things that needed saying. Is it okay that I enjoyed myself tonight? That I felt beautiful and interesting and alive? The answer came not in words, but in a feeling, a warmth that settled over me like Thomas's hand on my shoulder, reassuring and approving. I remembered what I told Robert about feeling Thomas's presence, not as a barrier, but as encouragement, and suddenly I understood that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. The last thing I remembered before sleep was Robert's voice saying my name with something close to reverence, and the way his eyes had held mine when he called me luminous. Tomorrow, I would wake up as a woman who had been on a successful date, who had a second date planned, who had remembered what it felt like to be seen and valued and desired. But first, I would sleep deeply and peacefully, wrapped in the twin comforts of love remembered and love anticipated, both equally real, both equally precious. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made me grateful to be alive to witness it. The maple tree in my front yard had reached peak color, its leaves a stunning display of gold and crimson that stopped neighbors in their tracks during their morning walks. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching a pair of cardinals take turns at the bird feeder Thomas had installed the year before he died. The day stretched ahead with unusual possibilities. Robert would pick me up at 6:30 for the concert, but that left me with nearly 10 hours to fill. Normally, this kind of empty Saturday would have felt overwhelming. Too much time to think, too many hours to navigate without purpose. Today, it felt like a gift. I spent the morning in my garden, preparing the flower beds for winter. The work was meditative, my hands moving through familiar motions while my mind wandered freely. As I cut back the last of the summer's perennials and covered the tender plants with mulch, I found myself humming, something I hadn't done since Thomas's death. The melody was nothing I recognized, just a happy tune that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep inside. Mrs. Henderson from next door appeared at our shared fence line, drawn by the unusual sound of activity in my yard on a weekend morning. "Eleanor, dear, you seem unusually energetic today," she said, leaning on her rake. "I heard you humming." "Did you?" I straightened up, brushing soil from my knees. I hadn't realized. "It's nice to hear. The yard missed the sound." She paused, studying my face with the frankness of someone who'd been my neighbor for 23 years. "You look different, lighter somehow." "I had dinner out Thursday night with a friend." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose with interest. "A gentleman friend?" "Yes, as a matter of fact. I felt heat rise in my cheeks but didn't try to hide it. Margaret arranged it." "Well, good for you, and good for Margaret. That woman has excellent instincts about people." She smiled warmly. "I hope it went well." "It did, very well." "Are you seeing him again?" "Tonight, actually. There's a concert at the community center." "How wonderful. You know, Harold and I used to love those community concerts. The acoustics in that old building are surprisingly good." She paused, then added gently, "Thomas would be pleased, dear. He always worried about you being alone too much." The comment should have stung, but instead it felt like validation. Thomas had worried about my tendency toward solitude even when he was alive, always encouraging me to maintain friendships and pursue interests beyond our marriage. He would indeed be pleased to know I was taking steps away from isolation. After lunch, I drove to the library for a few hours of volunteer work, helping with the weekend children's program. 23 small faces looked up at me as I read from a picture book about a brave mouse who learned to overcome her fears. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, reading about courage to children while trying to summon my own for the evening ahead. "Miss Eleanor," said 5-year-old Sophia as I was tidying up after story time, "you look pretty today." "Thank you, sweetheart. That's very kind of you to say." "Are you going somewhere special?" "I am, actually, to hear some music." "I like music. My mommy says music makes everything better." "Your mommy is very wise." I thought about Sophia's mother's words as I drove home. Music makes everything better. There was truth in that simple observation. Music had been one of the first things to return to my life after treatment ended. Not the sad songs that made me cry for Thomas, but the kind of music that reminded me I was still capable of joy. At home, I ran a bath and added lavender oil, something I hadn't done since before my diagnosis. The warm water felt luxurious against my skin, and I allowed myself to soak longer than practical, enjoying the simple pleasure of having time to prepare for an evening I was anticipating rather than dreading. Choosing what to wear proved easier than I'd expected. The black dress I'd worn to my nephew's wedding last spring still fit perfectly, and with my grandmother's pearl earrings and a light cardigan, I looked elegant without trying too hard. In the mirror, I practiced the smile I wanted Robert to see when he arrived, genuine, welcoming, confident. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:30. Through the peephole, I saw Robert standing on my porch holding a small bouquet of yellow roses, and my heart did a little skip of pleasure. Yellow roses for friendship and new beginnings. How had he known exactly the right choice? "You look beautiful," he said when I opened the door, his eyes warm with appreciation. "These are for you." "Thank you, they're perfect." I accepted the flowers, breathing in their subtle fragrance. "Let me put these in water quickly, and then I'll be ready." "Take your time, I'm enjoying the view." I felt his eyes follow me as I moved through the house, finding a vase and arranging the roses with more care than such a simple task required. Having someone watch me with pleasure rather than pity was still new enough to feel like a small miracle. "Ready," I announced, returning to the front hallway where Robert waited. "Then let's go make some memories," he said, offering his arm. The community center was buzzing with activity when we arrived. The parking lot was nearly full, and people streamed toward the entrance in small groups, chatting and laughing with the easy familiarity of neighbors gathering for a shared pleasure. Robert guided me through the crowd with a gentle hand on my back, his presence both protective and respectful. "Eleanor, Robert!" Margaret's voice cut through the pre-concert conversations as she approached us near the entrance. "I'm so glad you decided to come tonight. The lineup is wonderful. A local jazz trio, a folk singer who's supposed to be extraordinary, and the community choir is closing the show." "It sounds perfect," Robert replied. "Thank you for recommending it." Margaret beamed at us with the satisfaction of a successful matchmaker. "You two look lovely together. Have you gotten your tickets yet?" We made our way to the will call table, where a cheerful volunteer handed us programs and pointed toward the auditorium. The community center had been renovated several years earlier, and the performance space retained the charm of its 1950s origins while offering modern comfort. Robert found us seats about halfway back, with a clear view of the small stage, but far enough away to allow conversation if needed. "I haven't been to a concert in over a year," I confided as we settled into our seats. "Thomas and I used to come to these regularly, but it's hard to do the things you enjoyed together," Robert finished gently. "I understand. Patricia and I had season tickets to the symphony for 20 years. I haven't been back since she died." "Do you miss it? The music?" "I miss sharing it with someone who understood why certain pieces moved me. Music is better when it's witnessed together, don't you think?" Before I could answer, the lights dimmed and the jazz trio took the stage. The piano, bass, and drums began a slow, bluesy number that seemed to wrap around the audience like smoke. I found myself relaxing into the music, my shoulder touching Robert's arm where it rested on the seat between us. The piano was extraordinary, his fingers dancing across the keys with the kind of confidence that comes from decades of practice. During a particularly complex solo, I felt Robert's fingers brush against mine in the darkness, a question more than a statement. I turned my hand palm up, allowing him to take it properly, and felt his thumb trace gentle circles across my knuckles. We sat like that through the entire first set, hands linked, listening to music that seemed to speak directly to the tender places in our hearts. When the trio finished their final song to enthusiastic applause, Robert squeezed my hand gently before releasing it. "They're incredible," I whispered during the brief intermission. "You should see your face when you listen to music," Robert said, his voice low and warm. "You look like you're receiving a gift." Isn't that what music is? A gift from the musicians to everyone who hears it. I never thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. He stood and stretched. "Would you like some air before the next set?" We walked out to the lobby, where people clustered in small groups discussing the performance. Several acquaintances greeted me with surprise and pleasure. I hadn't been out in social settings much since Thomas's death, and my presence clearly delighted people who'd been wondering how I was managing. "Eleanor, you look wonderful," said Janet Morrison, who'd taught alongside Thomas for 15 years. "I've been meaning to call you." "Thank you, Janet. It's good to see you." I introduced Robert, watching as Janet's expression shifted from polite interest to genuine warmth when she realized this wasn't just a friend escorting a widow to a concert. "Are you enjoying the music?" she asked Robert. "Very much. Eleanor tells me these community concerts are always excellent. Oh, they are. This is quite a musical community. Eleanor, you should bring Robert to the holiday concert in December. The children's choir performs, and it's absolutely magical. The casual assumption that we'd still be seeing each other in December made something flutter in my chest. Not anxiety, but anticipation. December felt both impossibly far away and surprisingly close. As we returned to our seats for the second half of the program, I found myself imagining holiday concerts and winter evenings, shared meals and quiet conversations. The thoughts didn't feel presumptuous or desperate, just possible. The folk singer who took the stage for the second set was a woman about my age, with steel gray hair and a voice that seemed to carry the weight of lived experience. She sang about loss and hope, about the unexpected gifts that come wrapped in difficulty, about the courage it takes to remain open to love after heartbreak. During her final song, a haunting ballad about learning to bloom again after a harsh winter, I felt tears slide down my cheeks. But these weren't the bitter tears I'd grown accustomed to. They were softer somehow, cleansing rather than destructive. Robert noticed and offered his handkerchief without comment, his gesture natural and caring. When the concert ended and the audience rose to their feet in appreciation, Robert turned to me with concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it. That was exactly what I needed to hear tonight. We lingered as the crowd dispersed, neither of us eager to end the evening. Robert suggested coffee at a small cafe that stayed open late, and I found myself saying yes before I'd consciously decided. The cafe was nearly empty at 9:30 on a Saturday night, just a few college students hunched over laptops and an elderly man reading a newspaper in the corner. We chose a small table by the window and ordered decaf coffee and a slice of apple pie to share. "Tell me about your week," Robert said, settling back in his chair. "What did you do between Thursday night and tonight?" I found myself describing my days with more detail than I'd offered anyone in months. The progress in my pottery class, the new book display I'd organized at the library, the satisfaction of preparing my garden for winter. Small things, ordinary moments that had somehow become meaningful again. "You sound busy," Robert observed, happy busy. "I am, I think. For the first time in over a year, I'm looking forward to things instead of just getting through them." "What are you looking forward to?" The question was simple, but it made me pause. What was I looking forward to? Seeing how my winter pottery project turns out. The library's holiday program. We're planning something special for the children. And I hesitated, then decided to be brave. Seeing you again. Robert's smile was like sunrise. "I was hoping you'd say that." "I've been thinking about you constantly since Thursday night." "Constantly? That seems like a lot of thinking." "Well, maybe not constantly, but frequently, often. Whenever I wasn't actively focused on something else, you were there in my thoughts." He leaned forward slightly. "Is that too much honesty?" "It's exactly the right amount of honesty." I took a bite of the apple pie, sweet and warm with cinnamon. "I've been thinking about you too, wondering what you were doing, whether you were looking forward to tonight as much as I was. More, probably. I've been nervous all day." "Nervous? About what?" "About whether the magic of Thursday night was real, or if I'd imagined it, whether you'd still find me interesting in a different setting, whether I'd say something wrong and spoil whatever this is between us." I reached across the table and took his hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "This is real, Robert. Whatever this is, it's real." We finished our coffee slowly, reluctant to call an end to the evening. When Robert finally drove me home, we sat in his car outside my house for several minutes, talking about the music we'd heard and making plans for the following weekend. "There's a new exhibit opening at the Art Museum next Saturday," Robert said. "Contemporary sculptures. Would you be interested?" "I'd love that. I haven't been to the Art Museum in ages." "It's a date then. A proper afternoon date this time, followed by early dinner, if you're agreeable." "Very agreeable," I said, surprising myself again with my eagerness. Robert walked me to the door again, and this time when he kissed my cheek, I turned my head slightly so that our lips met instead. The kiss was soft, tentative, perfect, A question and an answer all at once. "Good night, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good night, Robert. Thank you for a perfect evening." I watched him drive away before going inside, my hand still tingling from his touch, my lips still warm from the kiss. In the bathroom mirror, I looked like a woman who'd been kissed, who'd been cherished, who was falling in love again at an age when most people assumed such things were finished. The realization should have terrified me, but instead it filled me with wonder. Love, apparently, had no expiration date. Hope, it seemed, could bloom at any season of life. As I prepared for bed, I thought about the folk singer's words about learning to bloom again after a harsh winter. Maybe that's exactly what I was doing, not betraying my past or abandoning my grief, but allowing something new and beautiful to grow in the space that healing had created. I fell asleep that night with Robert's name on my lips and music still playing in my heart. The following Tuesday brought the first real cold snap of the season, and I woke to find frost covering my car windshield and the last of the garden flowers blackened by the overnight freeze. But instead of feeling melancholy about the end of growing season, I found myself energized by the change, as if the crisp air had awakened something dormant in my spirit. I was humming again as I prepared breakfast, the same mysterious tune that had emerged during my weekend gardening. The sound filled the quiet kitchen and seemed to chase away the shadows that had lurked in corners since Thomas's death. Even the empty chair across from me at the breakfast table felt less like an accusation and more like a promise that someday, perhaps, it might be occupied again. The phone rang as I was finishing my second cup of coffee, and Robert's name on the caller ID made my pulse quicken with anticipation. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good morning yourself. You're up early. Couldn't sleep past 6. I kept thinking about Saturday night, about how right it felt to have you beside me during the concert. His voice grew softer. "I hope that doesn't sound presumptuous." "It sounds perfect. I was thinking the same thing." "Were you? Good. I was calling to see if you'd like to have lunch today. Nothing fancy, just that little sandwich shop downtown. I found myself wanting to see you before the weekend." The invitation sent warmth spreading through my chest. "I'd love to. What time?" "Noon. That way you can get your morning errands done, and I can finish the bookshelf I'm building for my daughter." "You build furniture?" "Badly, but with great enthusiasm. Patricia used to joke that my carpentry skills were matched only by my confidence in using them." The mention of his late wife came naturally now, without the careful pause that had marked his earlier references. She was usually right. We arranged to meet at the cafe, and I spent the rest of the morning with unusual attention to my appearance. Not because I felt insecure, but because I wanted to look nice for Robert, wanted to see that flash of appreciation in his eyes when he saw me approaching. The mirror reflected back a woman I was still learning to recognize. Bald, but not diminished, marked by experience, but not defeated. I chose a burgundy sweater that brought out the warmth in my complexion and spent extra time on my makeup, not to hide anything, but to enhance what was already there. The cafe was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived, filled with downtown office workers and shoppers taking a break from errands. I spotted Robert immediately, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the entrance, and his face lit up when our eyes met. "You look lovely," he said, standing to pull out my chair. "That cover is perfect on you." "Thank you. You're not bad yourself." And he wasn't, dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater that made his eyes look even more warm and inviting. We ordered sandwiches and soup, falling into conversation with the ease that was becoming characteristic of our time together. Robert told me about his morning's carpentry adventures, complete with a detailed description of the bookshelf disaster that had required 3 attempts to get the measurements right. "My daughter will probably accept it graciously and then quietly replace it with something actually functional," he said, laughing. "But she'll appreciate the thought." "How many children do you have?" "2. Jenny, who's 38 and lives about an hour away with her husband and twin boys, and Michael, who's 41 and convinced that his old man needs constant supervision now that his mother's gone. Robert's expression grew fond. They're good kids, even if they do worry too much about me. Do they know about me? The question slipped out before I could censor it, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. We'd had 2 dates and a phone call, hardly enough to warrant discussion with adult children. Actually, yes, Robert said, surprisingly. I told them I'd met someone special, someone who made me remember what it felt like to look forward to things. And what did they say? Jenny cried, which is what she does when she's happy. Michael peppered me with questions about your character, your intentions, and whether you were going to break his father's heart. Robert grinned. I assured him that my heart was in excellent hands. The words made my throat tight with emotion. I hope that's true. Eleanor. Robert reached across the table and took my hand. Look at me. I raised my eyes to meet his, seeing nothing but sincerity and growing affection in his gaze. I know we've only known each other for a few days, but I need you to know something. You're not a consolation prize or a distraction from grief or an old man's attempt to recapture his youth. You're a gift I never expected to receive, an answer to prayers I was afraid to pray. My eyes filled with tears, but they were the good kind, the kind that came from being truly seen and valued. You're going to make me cry in public. Then I'll hand you my napkin and order you another cup of coffee and sit here while you compose yourself, because some things are worth saying regardless of the setting. And that's exactly what he did. When the tears came, Robert passed me his napkin without comment, signaled the waitress for more coffee, and waited patiently while I dabbed at my eyes and gathered myself. His presence felt like a shelter, a safe harbor where I could be vulnerable without judgment. I'm not used to this, I said finally, to being cherished by someone new. It feels wonderful and terrifying at the same time. What's terrifying about it? The possibility of loss, of caring about someone again and having them taken away. I stirred my coffee absently. I know that's not rational, that life doesn't work that way, but once you've lost someone central to your existence, you know how devastating it can be, Robert finished. I understand that fear, Eleanor. I feel it too. You do? Every time I start to care about you more, every time I catch myself planning future conversations or imagining holidays we might spend together, part of me warns that it's dangerous to hope for permanence. He leaned forward. But then I remember that the alternative to risking love is guaranteed loneliness, and that seems like a much worse fate. When did you get so wise? Probably around the 3rd time I almost called you and hung up before dialing, then spent the evening kicking myself for being a coward. His smile was self-deprecating. Wisdom sometimes looks a lot like desperation dressed up in better clothes. We finished lunch slowly, savoring both the food and the deepening connection between us. When Robert walked me to my car, he kissed me properly this time. Not a polite peck on the cheek, but a real kiss that made my knees weak and reminded me that passion didn't have an expiration date. Saturday can't come soon enough, he said against my lips. I was just thinking the same thing. I drove home with the radio turned up and the windows cracked despite the cold, feeling more alive than I had in months. The house welcomed me with its familiar warmth, but for the first time since Thomas's death, it didn't feel like a refuge from life so much as a place to rest between adventures. That afternoon, I called Sarah to share my news and found myself giddy with the kind of excitement I hadn't felt since my children were young, and every small pleasure felt momentous. "Mom, you sound like a teenager," Sarah said, but her voice was warm with approval. "I can't remember the last time I heard you laugh like that." "I can't remember the last time I felt like laughing like that." "Tell me about him. Really tell me. Not just the basics Margaret shared, but what you think about him." I settled into Thomas's old reading chair, something I'd avoided doing since he died, and found it felt right rather than painful. He's kind, Sarah, genuinely kind, not just polite. He listens when I talk, really listens, and he seems to find me interesting rather than just tolerable company. What else? He makes me feel beautiful, not just acceptable or presentable, but actually beautiful. When he looks at me, I see myself through his eyes, and I like what I see there. That's wonderful, Mom. That's everything. Is it wrong that I'm falling for him so quickly? Your father and I had months of friendship before we acknowledged romantic feelings. This feels accelerated. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering. Maybe it feels fast because you're not 22 anymore. You know what matters and what doesn't. You don't have time for games or pretense or the kind of uncertainty that makes sense when you're young and think you have forever to figure things out. You think it's okay to trust these feelings? I think it's okay to trust yourself. You loved Dad completely for 38 years. You know what real love looks like. If you're recognizing something similar with Robert, then maybe you should pay attention to that recognition. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk, watching the last light fade from the sky and thinking about Sarah's words. Maybe she was right. Maybe the intensity of what I felt for Robert wasn't recklessness, but wisdom, the kind of clarity that comes from having loved deeply and lost completely and found the courage to risk both again. Wednesday and Thursday passed in a haze of anticipation. I caught myself checking my appearance in mirrors, planning what I might wear to the art museum, rehearsing conversations I wanted to have with Robert. The days felt fuller somehow, charged with possibility in a way that made even routine tasks feel more purposeful. Friday evening brought another phone call from Robert, and we talked for nearly 2 hours about everything and nothing. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, dreams we'd harbored and abandoned, and perhaps found again. His voice in my ear felt intimate and comforting, and when we finally said goodnight, I realized I'd been curled up in bed fully clothed, too absorbed in our conversation to bother changing. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything look sharper, more defined. I woke with excitement rather than anxiety, eager for the day that would bring Robert back into my presence and extend our time together from hours into a full afternoon and evening. As I prepared for our date, our third date, I realized with wonder, I caught myself humming again, that same mysterious melody that had become the soundtrack to my emerging happiness. In the mirror, I saw a woman preparing for love, and for the first time in over a year, the reflection looked exactly like someone I wanted to be.